For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. 7 words. 7 words that have haunted every civilization that encountered them. 7 words spoken to a man, standing in a garden, the moment he realized he was going to die. Genesis 3 verse 19, written approximately 3,000 years ago, by people who had no telescope, no microscope, no particle accelerator, no language for atoms, for stars, for the nuclear processes happening inside collapsing suns. They were trying to explain the worst thing a human being can be told, that all of this is temporary, and in doing so, without knowing it, they wrote the most scientifically accurate sentence in human history. They just didn't know it yet, and neither did we, until very recently. Every civilization that has ever existed has wrestled with the same question, not the question of God, not the question of meaning, the question underneath both of those, the question that wakes you at 3 a.m. when the room is dark and the silence is too complete. What am I? Not who, not why, what? What is the substance of this thing that thinks and breathes and fears its own ending? For 3,000 years, 2 separate traditions developed 2 separate answers. One was written in ancient Hebrew by scribes who believed they were recording divine revelation. The other was written in the language of mathematics and physics by people who believed they were recording observable fact. They never spoke to each other. They arrived at the same answer. That convergence, that impossible meeting of sacred text and particle physics, is what this investigation is about. In 1957, a paper was published by 4 astrophysicists, Burbage, Fowler, and Hoyle. It changed everything we thought. We knew about where we come from. The paper was called Synthesis of the Elements in Stars. It demonstrated for the first time that every heavy element in the universe, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron, was forged inside dying stars, not created on Earth, not created in space, created inside stars, in the nuclear furnaces, at the core of collapsing suns, and then scattered across the universe. When those stars exploded, supernovae, the deaths of stars, became the birth of everything else. The human body is made of approximately 7 octillion atoms, 7 followed by 27 zeros. Every single one of those atoms was forged in a star that no longer exists. The calcium in your bones, created in a supernova. The iron in your blood, created in a stellar collision. The carbon that forms the basis of every cell in your body, born in the nuclear core of a star that died before the Earth existed. You are not from Earth. You are from the stars that built Earth.
The cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
The most influential science communicator of the 20th century spent his career trying to make astrophysics accessible to ordinary people. In 1980, he said something that stopped the world. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. And then, in a different context, something even more precise. We are made of star stuff. He was describing the same thing. Genesis described 3,000 years earlier. Different language, different authority, same conclusion. For dust you are. We are made of star stuff. 2 sentences, 3 millennia apart, saying the same thing. Here is where it gets interesting. Sagan was not a religious man. He was a rigorous scientist who followed evidence wherever it led. He wasn't quoting Genesis. He wasn't trying to confirm scripture. He was describing what the physics showed. And the physics showed what the ancient text had already said. Now, the philosopher in the room would stop here and ask, what does this convergence mean? There are three possible answers. The first, coincidence. The ancient writers described dust because dust was what they saw. The fact that dust turned out to be stellar matter is accidental, a poetic metaphor that happened to align with later physics. The second, intuition, that human beings have always had, a felt sense of their connection to something larger than themselves, and that sometimes, before the language of science existed, that intuition expressed itself as myth, as metaphor, as sacred text. The third answer is the one that neither scientists nor theologians are entirely comfortable with, that the text knew, not through divine dictation, not through mystical experience, but through something we don't have a name for yet, a form of knowing that precedes methodology, that sits underneath both faith and evidence. That is not proof of God. It is something more unsettling than proof. It is the possibility that the boundary between the sacred and the scientific is a boundary we drew ourselves, and that the universe never recognized it. The word translated as dust in Genesis 3 verse 19 is the Hebrew word afar. Afar doesn't mean dust the way we use the word today, something dirty, something to be swept away. In ancient Hebrew, afar meant fine particles, loose matter, the elemental substance from which form emerges. The same word is used in Job 10 verse 9. Remember that you made me like clay, and will you return me to the dust? Afar. And in Psalm 103 verse 14, for he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are afar. Far. Elemental particles, the basic building blocks of matter. 3,000 years before particle physics, the text was using language that particle physicists would eventually understand better than theologians. And to dust you shall return. The second half of the verse is as precise as the first. Every atom in your body will continue to exist. After you die, they don't disappear, they disperse. The carbon returns to the soil, the iron oxidizes, the calcium dissolves slowly back into the elemental record, and over millions of years, those atoms become part of other things, other organisms, other structures, eventually other stars. You don't cease to exist. You return to the cycle that produced you. That is not religion. That is chemistry. And what separates the ancient text from modern physics is not the conclusion. The conclusion is identical. What separates them is the why. Physics tells you what happens. It does not tell you what it means. Genesis tells you what it means, cannot tell you the mechanism. This is not a failure of either tradition. It is a description of the limits of every system of knowledge human beings have ever constructed. Aristotle called it the unmoved mover, the thing that sets everything in motion without itself being moved. Kant called it the thing in itself, the reality behind the appearances that reason cannot reach. Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And Genesis, 3,000 years before any of them, stood at the same edge and simply said, you are dust, not as an insult, not as a punishment, as a location. You are here, at the boundary, between the knowable and everything else, made of star stuff, capable of knowing it, unable to fully explain what that knowing means. Physics and scripture are not enemies at this boundary. They are two people, standing at the same cliff edge, looking into the same dark. One is holding a telescope, the other is holding a lamp, and the dark remains. If you are made of star stuff, if every atom in your body was forged in a dying star, billions of years before you were born, then you have never been a small thing. You are the product of cosmic violence and cosmic time. You are the universe, looking at itself, and the moment you die, you return to that process, not as a soul ascending somewhere, not as a body decomposing into nothing, as matter rejoining, the oldest cycle in existence. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That is not a punishment. It is a description of the most extraordinary process in the known universe. There is one thing the physics cannot explain. Not yet, perhaps not ever. How did the atoms know to become you? The carbon, the nitrogen, the iron, they've been cycling through the universe for billions of years, part of stars that no longer exist, part of planets that predate life, part of organisms that lived and died before anything on Earth could wonder. And then, for a brief, improbable window, they assembled into a configuration capable of asking the question, why am I here? The philosopher David Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness. Why is there something it is like to be you? Why does matter at sufficient complexity begin to experience itself? Physics can describe the neurons firing, cannot explain why the firing feels like something from the inside. That gap between chemistry and experience, between process and meaning, is the oldest philosophical problem in human history, and it is the gap that Genesis was always pointing at, not filling, pointing at. The text doesn't explain consciousness. It names the territory. You are dust that became aware of itself. And the question it leaves open, the question that no tradition, no science, no philosophy has fully answered, is what that awareness is for. Genesis 3 verse 19 was written as a moment of loss, a man being told that his time is finite, that the ground will reclaim him, that the story ends. But read through what we know now, through supernovae and stellar nucleosynthesis, and the cycling of matter across billions of years, it reads differently, not as an ending, not as a punishment, as a philosophical position. You are not a soul trapped in matter. You are not a machine that thinks. You are the universe, at a particular stage of its own self-examination. You are dust that evolved eyes to look back at the stars, came from. You are the cosmos, experiencing its own existence through the instrument of a human life. And the moment you die, you don't disappear. You return to the investigation. The atoms disperse. The cycle continues. The universe goes on, knowing itself through other forms. The Stoics called this logos, the rational principle, running through all matter. Spinoza called it deus sive natura, God or nature, the same thing by two names. The ancient Hebrews called it afar, dust, the substance that connects, the created to the creator. Sagan called it star stuff. Different words, different centuries, different methods, the same territory. You are here, at the intersection of all of them, made of what the stars discarded, carrying the question they couldn't ask. For dust you are, and to dust, to the stars, to the cycle, to the investigation that never ends, you shall return. Genesis doesn't end at chapter 3, and the question of what we are made of doesn't end at astrophysics. There is a deeper layer to this text, one that ancient Jewish scholars called the sod, the hidden meaning, the level beneath the literal, the interpretation that was passed from teacher to student in whispers for centuries because it was considered too dangerous for ordinary people to hear. What the sod reveals about Genesis 3 verse 19 is something that makes the astrophysics look simple. That is the next episode. But before you leave, I want to ask you something. Not what you believe, not whether you're religious. I want to ask what you think. Because that distinction between belief and thought is exactly what this channel exists for. Leave a comment below. What does it mean to you that you are made of star stuff? Does it make you feel smaller, one temporary configuration of ancient matter? Or does it make you feel larger, the universe looking at itself through your eyes? There is no right answer. There is only the question, and the people willing to sit with it. That is who Sons of Dust is for. If you want to continue this investigation, subscribe. Not because I'm asking for the number, because the next episode goes somewhere most people are not willing to follow, and I want you there when it does.